Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you. My name is Shelli Poe, and I'm the senior pastor here at Little River United Church of Christ. I want to begin by offering a warm welcome to each of you. We invite you to come back and join us on a Sunday if you're into that sort of thing. We are a community of Jesus followers who seek to embody the Spirit of God in love and in justice. Little River strives to be an anti-racist church, and we are open and affirming to those in the LGBTQ+ community. As I say every Sunday, whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Tom Shoop, as you know, author of A Place Called Ilda. And before I turn it over to Brian to introduce him, I want to thank our anti-racism ministry team and our women's ministry team for co-sponsoring this event and making it happen this afternoon. I also want to recognize a number of guests who are with us today. If you wouldn't mind standing or just giving us a wave, we would love to recognize you before we begin. With us today are Ms. Joyce Bellamy and Ms. Thelma Grayson of the First Baptist Church of Merrifield, where Ilda residents attended church. Would you give us a wave? Thank you. Yes, and there's more. Ms. Worthy Duckett, her sister Annette, and her spouse, I didn't catch your name, I'm so sorry, and brother Ernst Wright, who are all descendants of Ilda residents. We also have Mr. Andre Newman with us today. He is a direct descendant on his father's side of the Newman family, who were enslaved at Oak Hill Plantation. We also want to recognize Penny Gross, former supervisor of Mason District, who's here with us today. And Frank Anderson from Braddock District, Supervisor Walkinshaw's office. Thank you. We're also expecting Olivia Logan from Mason District Supervisor Jimenez's office, and hopefully she'll find her way. We are so glad that each of you are here, as well as everyone who is attending today. I'd like to open our time together with a prayer from Arthur Cole Riley, author of Black Liturgies. Let us pray. God of the street, you know by heart. I know these steps. They're etched with memories, reminding me I am made of story. As I pass each building, each door, travel with me into my former selves. Keep me from that nostalgia which chains me to the past, but help me smell and taste and listen and feel and observe all that has made me. Help me become curious how my sense of home is responsible for my formation. But may I do so with self-compassion, never daring to travel streets my inner child is unsafe or unprepared to encounter. As I turn corners and peek down alleys, as I speed up and slow down, may I at last make my way home. And if that home be entirely new, safer, kinder, truer, may my inmost being find the rest and comfort I was made for. Amen. I'd like to invite Brian Payne forward to introduce Tom to us.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Payne, and I'm representing our anti-racism ministry today. The format is going to be an interview between Karen Flann and Tom Shoop. As you can tell, there's two chairs up here on either side of the flowers. They'll go on for 45 minutes or so, and then we will have time for questions from the audience where I'll walk around with the mic. And you will notice if you're speaking into the mic and you speak up close, you can hear me. And if you hold the mic down here, it doesn't work, does it? No. So speak into the mic. Okay. Karen is representing our Women's Ministry Book Group, which is the co-sponsor with our anti-racism ministry today. And she has a unique connection to this group. She also sings with a group called Mosaic Harmony. And in 2004, when there was the procession from First Baptist Church in Merrifield to Pleasant Valley Memorial Park next door to reinter the remains from the Guinea Road Cemetery, she was part of the group that sang. So, a nice connection. Tom, I'm going to spend less time introducing because you're going to hear more from him. You're here to hear about the book. You don't want to hear about me. Here's the book. Here's the author. Tom, Karen, take it away.
Tom's career was in journalism, and recently you were editor-in-chief of a federal publication, very large journal. And now, all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden, but it looks like it, you've switched gears and you've done extensive historical research, which is quite different from opinion writing. So yes. I wondered if you could talk about how that happened, how that switch happened.
Sure. I didn't actually do much opinion writing. So most of my work, for the bulk of the time I was in journalism, I was an editor. And so this is in a way getting back to sort of the roots of what I started doing in journalism, which was research and writing. And even further back, I was a history major in college, and I had hoped to indulge myself at some point in doing some history work and justifying myself to my professors. So that was gratifying to do. Wonderful.
Well, before I read this book, the only time I'd ever heard of Ilda was the local swimming pool. And I think it was down Guinea Road, the community pool. So I wondered about the name Ilda and what you could say about where that came from.
Sure. The Ilda name, well, let me take a step back and say, how I got started on working on this project was through initially going to an open house at Oak Hill, which is a historic plantation house, still privately owned, over on the other side of 236. The county has, thanks to the efforts of Penny Gross and others, has a historic and conservation easement on the property requiring that it be open to the public at least once a year. So I went to one of those open houses years ago, and it always sort of stuck with me. And in the summer of 2021, I thought, I wonder what the county is doing to reckon with the history of these kind of places, which tended to be presented as Thomas Jefferson slept here 4 times, and which is great, but there's a whole other history that needed to be told. And the county has in fact been doing a really impressive job of trying to do that, to tell the fuller story. So I got interested in that. And I was looking for sort of a contrasting story, and I remember Ilda Pool and seeing an historic marker on Little River Turnpike for Ilda, which I'd never actually stopped to read, so I did. And that gradually became a much more fascinating story. And that led me to, it led me very quickly to the Fairfax City Regional Library, where the librarians there told me, other people who had worked on research about the Ilda area told me, stop what you're doing and go look at a book called Shades of Gray by Harim Badil Abish and his family members you heard from earlier. And I owe an incredible debt of gratitude to you and to him for the work that was done, and it is an amazingly impressive piece of research. And in the book, he says, it ends up being growing from a family history into much wider than that. And he said, it's because no one has ever done any work in this area at all. And this was not that long ago that he produced this work. And I couldn't believe it, but it was true. It still is probably the most authoritative source of information about certainly the people, the Gibson and Parker families of Ilda, and stretching out as far as Falls Church and over to Fairfax as well. So that's sort of the backstory as to how the Ilda name came about. That's also revealed in that book. Horace Gibson and his wife, Margaret, had a daughter, Matilda. And according to family lore, that contraction of that name, Matilda, became the name of Ilda. And not only has no one put forward a more plausible explanation than that, I don't think anyone has ever put forward any other explanation than that. So as far as I'm concerned, that's just the truth.
Well, it's quite amazing to find all this out, that we're living right here and we don't know anything about what has happened in the past.
Well, I've got a book you can read.
Oh, that's a good idea. Well, and speaking of your book, you had mentioned there's a passage that you'd like to share today.
Sure. It's a short passage, and I chose this one because it refers directly to the land we're on right now. And I want to preface it by saying to the members of the congregation and to the leadership of the church, if you happen to see me on the multiple occasions that I was tromping around in your woods over here, thank you for not calling the police.
Since so many of us are sitting here with it, could you cite the page number?
Sure, page 17. Section is called No Mean Action. In 1807, William Gooding Jr. opened a namesake tavern on the brand new Little River Turnpike. His father was a tenant on a parcel of land controlled by a man who had in turn leased it from Henry Fitzhugh. That's of the very influential Fitzhugh family. Gooding's Tavern soon became a popular landmark on the turnpike, known for its owner's hospitality, fried chicken, peaches and honey, and Cornwallis, a corn whiskey. As the business grew, William Gooding started buying up Ravensworth land. In 1814, he purchased 60 acres north of the turnpike, where the tavern and his home were located, right near here. He later bought another 100 acres south of the road. His operation later grew to include a blacksmith shop and stable. At the time of his death in 1861, the Alexandria Gazette declared that Gooding was, in many respects, a remarkable man. Without education, by his honest industry, he amassed a comfortable independence without ever stooping to mean action. William Gooding's will lists among his property 31 enslaved people whom he doled out to his children, along with, quote, the future increase of the females among them, unquote. Gooding's sons, Peter and William H. Gooding, eventually became major landowners, slaveholders, and influential local leaders themselves. Today, the centerpiece of the Gooding's land is a bucolic sliver of suburbia, home to the Pleasant Valley Memorial Park and the Little River United Church of Christ. The cemetery was established in 1963 by a small group of developers who wanted to create a last resting place for people of all backgrounds and faiths. Strolling along the small road that winds into the woods between the church and the cemetery, it doesn't take much imagination to picture what it must have looked like in the mid-19th century. Of course, keep walking and soon modernity introduces cognitive dissonance into the scene. Against a backdrop of tract houses on one side and an electrical substation on the other sits the Gooding family's small cemetery. The graveyard is fairly well preserved, although it's easy to trip over some of the smaller headstones in the tall grass. In 1958, Mabel Lowry, a descendant of William Gooding, reported to her daughter-in-law that there were some, quote, colored graves, unquote, to the north of the Gooding family cemetery, and that she had located stones there in 1952. I would just add as an aside, she's right, as someone who has tromped through there. That is definitely the case. A county map of the area, also issued in 1958, shows the presence of grave markers in that area. Today, the area immediately to the north of the Gooding plots is overgrown and strewn with trash. But several of what appear to be fieldstone markers are visible in the underbrush. As for the Gooding headstones, many of their inscriptions are worn away, but some are still legible after brushing aside the 2-foot-tall clumps of grass that cover them. Sacred to the memory of Peter Gooding, one reads, a kind neighbor and a friend to the poor. At the time of his death, Peter Gooding held 27 people in bondage.
One of the challenges that I'm sure you faced was that the names of these people who were held in bondage were generally known only by first name and no last name. And that in your book you mentioned that many of the slaves actually did have last names, but they chose to have those hidden from their slaveholders. So that certainly complicated doing any research when you don't have an idea of the last family name.
Yes, and especially gravestone research. Many of these are just field stones or no stones at all, and just grave depressions that are indicators of grave sites. So it becomes, and this came into play very much with respect to the Guinea Road Cemetery that's sort of at the heart of the book.
Yes.
Where it took an enormous amount of technical research to identify remains and couldn't obviously identify specific individuals, but did determine that they were very likely enslaved people dating back for a few generations.
Mm-hmm. It's surprising to me, and I'm sure to everyone in this room, because all of us use Little River Turnpike, and we know the speed limit. And usually I drive the speed limit, but still that's pretty fast. And when you're driving 45 miles an hour, you're not taking in the scenery, and you're not really looking at what's around you. So I never noticed any markers whatsoever until I read this book, and then I actually sought them out. So now I have visited the Gooding Tavern marker. It's within walking distance of this property, probably a 3-minute walk to get there. And just further down Guinea and 236 is the intersection with the marker that you mentioned that's dedicated to the Ilda community. That corner and that side, especially of Guinea Road, is where so many businesses wanted to develop it, but for one reason or another, it just seemed like it wouldn't happen. And there were rumors that there was a slave cemetery, or a cemetery, I should say, there. But it didn't seem to be documented officially.
No, it was not. Initially they thought there were no references, official references to a cemetery there. That turned out not to be the case. Over the years, various references to a house of worship dating back to the early 1700s that was potentially there, and the fact that there was a graveyard at that site. It turned out there were, in fact, references to it. There was also family history that documented this, and some of it was written down. And not only that, everyone in the neighborhood knew it. And not only that, and I can say this because I'm in a house of worship today, there was some force at work, I ended up concluding, because they tried to put a gas station, a grocery store, 2 different child care centers, a headquarters for the Fairfax County Salvation Army, all of that All of those plans fell through to a greater or lesser extent because people stepped forward to say, there is a cemetery at that site.
So when it was decided that Guinea Road would be widened, it seemed to be a shock to VDOT that there were human remains.
Yes. Now, just to set the stage for that, at this point, which would have been in the early 2000s, Harim Badil Abish had completed his work and had completed his journey in this life. And his work had been taken up by Dennis Howard, a relative of his, although they were unknown to each other for a long time and actually did parallel work, which reinforced a lot of the information that they uncovered. So there was that record. Numerous archaeologists, including one from a world-renowned scientist from the Smithsonian Institution who I had the good fortune to meet and talk with, he walked the site, said definitely, absolutely there are gravestones there. And I won't speculate as to the reason, but VDOT concluded there was no cemetery there, that it was just a story.
At the same time, I think I read in the book that the manager of the VDOT expansion project put up a sign.
Yes. I don't want to paint VDOT as being this monolithic enemy. Yes, there was one of the VDOT managers put up a huge sign on Little River Turnpike and said, if you know anything about a family cemetery on this site, call this number. And Dennis Howard drove by and called it and doggedly pursued. And you know, it's in a way inspiring what he did, in a way infuriating, because he really had to make a lot of noise, went to the governor's office, and I'm convinced that VDOT just was taking the position that to humor him and the families, will do an excavation, and they did, and they found 29 graves on the first day.
And I didn't know VDOT had archaeologists that work with them
Yeah.
to do the work. That was
Yes,
news to me.
for just these types of situations. And it should be said in their defense that from that point forward, they were very respectful of handling the remains and working with the families and representatives of the families about what to do with the people interred there. So it ended up having essentially a happy ending in that regard.
Mm-hmm. The reinterment process ended up coinciding with the family reunion from someone, I can't remember which.
Dennis Howard organized
Yes.
that. Mm-hmm.
So that made it an interesting way to celebrate that discovery of the remains and to respectfully have them reinterred.
Yes. Yeah, it ended up, and he very much wanted to be able to have a celebration with a reinterment in connection with this family reunion. And I think, you know, in the process, I talked to people who were involved in that and read about some of the scientists' findings, and they did a presentation for the family on what they found. And what one person told me was really instructive to me, and that is that, you know, it was an informative but dispassionate presentation in which they showed graves, and in which, quite frankly, the white people in the audience said, "That's fascinating," was essentially their reaction. And the black people in the audience said, "My God, those are my ancestors." And I think it was a lesson for a lot of people in the room about the importance of being respectful in these and realizing that these were real people who clearly had suffered a lot.
The part of the process that was held across the street at the Northern Virginia Community College was a 3-hour program, and there were a variety of presentations about the discovery of the remains and a little bit about the identification process. It was very respectful, and we sang as part of it. So I think that was very educational as well as inspirational program.
Yeah, it's among the many things I wish I had been able to witness.
I noticed at the back of your book there's probably 15 pages of notes and acknowledgments, lists of materials that you used. You used periodicals, you did interviews, you have books, there are oral histories that you cite. And I wondered what you found most helpful in your work.
It all starts with Harim's book, and then working outward from there. In connection with the discovery of the remains at Guinea Road, both the Fairfax City Regional Library and a contractor hired by VDOT did extensive work on the history of the area. So that was enormously helpful to me. And one of the researchers, her name is Maddie McCoy, she features in the book. I met her, and she had just a trove of information and work she had done about the history of Ilda, and that started me on my way. And I came into the picture around 2021, and this was a good 10 years after the initial research was done. And where I sort of picked things up was there were a couple of ways that I feel like I contributed to adding more information. One was since that period, many newspapers, including African American newspapers, have been digitized and made searchable. So Horace Gibson, one of the founders of Ilda, was shot by a crazy neighbor. If you haven't read the book, I won't say more than that, but this guy really liked to shoot people. And he was shot, he was attacked at the blacksmith shop. These stories often, it was a Richmond black newspaper that I found the story of details about him being shot. So there was stuff like that was just not available. The other thing that I lucked out on was digitized records of the Fairfax County Board of Zoning Appeals. Anytime somebody wants to do something, especially commercial, with a property, there is a whole process by which people are allowed to comment and bring in additional information. And the minutes of their meetings going back to the turn of the 20th century are all digitized and had fascinating stuff. That's where I learned about all the efforts to develop the property where the cemetery was. So that was, they're even better than with apologies to Penny Gross, they're even better than the Board of Supervisors digital records.
I wondered if you could comment on the changes that took place in the Ilda community between the time of the Civil War and then moving into the Jim Crow era.
Sure. This was a real learning point for me. There was a period, the period of Reconstruction held out all kinds of promise for people of all races to live and work together. And it was not idyllic, but two formerly enslaved men could move their families to Fairfax County, work for a couple years, have enough money to buy land, and use their skills and their business savvy. I mean, they were smart enough to get themselves trained as blacksmiths and smart enough to pick the ideal location for that business, because people had to go to the courthouse to do all manner of legal business and business, and farmers came the other direction, taking their crops to for sale in Alexandria and the District of Columbia. So it was, it was a common place for your horse-drawn wagon to break down on what was a terrible Little River turnpike. If you can believe it, it was worse back then. So they had a real opportunity. Within a few years, they'd started a business. Their families were set on a good course. They were voting in elections. And this was just very quickly just wiped out. And that promise was gone. And it was replaced by a Jim Crow system that systematically instituted white supremacy. And people across the country, well, let's just say it, white people across the country were okay with that. And that was a real eye-opener for me. I mean, I knew that some of the history, but to realize that there was a moment of real opportunity there that was just taken away from people and to experience it, and that's what I tried to do in the book, was to bring the reader into that world in a very sort of micro sense, where you can see how this played out at one particular place. I mean, people who have been around in this area longer than I have may remember there used to be a drive-in movie in a huge movie theater, which I swear you could see from space. And it was segregated. You couldn't be in a car next to, I don't understand.
I wondered how you would compare or see the Ilda community in relationship to other Black communities in Fairfax County.
Sure. I think the short answer is that one of the differences was it wasn't just a Black community. It wasn't a freedman's village. It wasn't a place that was set aside for African Americans. It was a community that arose around a business that was central to the community that happened to be owned by two African American men. And there were both Black and white people living there, and by most of the time they seemed to get along. And then gradually things, and this is where it gets kind of murky, because there's no moment where Horace Gibson or Moses Parker are there to say, I'm washing my hands of this area. It's just thoroughly segregated Merrifield became a more hospitable place for them to live, because they were shut out of basic things like the school in their community and the church. So just gradually, the African Americans from the area either moved there or to points elsewhere in the region or to points north. There was a whole subset of family members who ended up in Ansonia, Connecticut.
Amazing. One of the quotes that you and I both liked, especially in the book, is "All history is local." And you've spent this time in this research on Ilda. I wonder how the local history of Ilda reflects on regional and national history.
Yeah, I'm a very big believer, even more so now that I've finished this book, that all history, like all politics, is local. And to understand what happened, you need to drill down deep into individual areas and see how the great themes and trends of American history, from race to religion to transportation to economic development, any of those, how they all played out on a small scale, really helps you understand, I think, much better than just having broad overviews with examples of how things happened in American history. So I was telling someone earlier, as I was working on the book, I had at one point a working title of American Intersection, because I didn't want it to necessarily just be pigeonholed as a local history, but an example of how big events unfolded at the local level. And I would also say, I mean, as I think I've made clear, there's in many ways this is a tragic story. It's a story with a good ending, if not a happy one. But it's a very serious story. So I want to, having said that, I do want to shift gears a little bit, because Shelli preached this morning on contemptible joy and having joy despite difficult circumstances. So I'd like to, on the All History is Local front, point out a few things. Some are in the book, some I think are not, that are just, in which local history is just plain fascinating. So in 1930, I need to rely on my notes here because I'll forget the specifics. In 1930, beans started raining from the sky over Ilda. The agriculture department was called in and determined they were the seeds of sour gum trees that starlings and blackbirds had feasted on and then spit out the seeds by the thousands. Before Prohibition, Ilda was a common meeting place for well-attended temperance rallies. During Prohibition, a priest from St. Mary's in Fairfax Station, and I can say this because that's a Catholic church, we're okay with that, was arrested near Ilda with a half-gallon of booze in his car. He paid a $50 fine and got a suspended sentence. In the 1960s, Ilda was home to, and see if someone can name this, at the corner of Little River and Prosperity, before it was Pizza Hut.
Oh.
Squire Rockwell's was across the street. Well, Gino's Hamburgers was what I was thinking of, which then became Pizza Hut, which then became Ariake Japanese restaurant, which it is today. This is another one for Hube. In 1965, when Virginia finally gave up its fight against integrating schools, black students were able to go to Wakefield Forest Elementary School in Ilda, where they would have immediately encountered segregation by gender. Boys and girls were taught in separate classrooms for several years under the theory that boys would progress faster if they didn't have to compete against girls. In 1968, two men opened a 600 square foot real estate office in Ilda. Their names were Henry Long and Wesley Foster. Wow. And they built kind of a nice little business out of that. And in the this is sort of Greater Ilda, but since we're in kind of Greater Ilda today, in the 1970s, just down Prosperity Avenue, lived a guy named Mark Felt. Anyone know who he was? Better known as Deep Throat in the Watergate scandal. So there's more to Ilda than you might think.
Well, I do want to ask you, while we have you, what your thoughts are or what your ideas are about a future project.
I have a couple of thoughts on that. Since I have read some of the history of this church that was provided to me, I am fascinated by its story, and someone needs to at least write an article about it for publication. For those who are not familiar with it, I won't go into the whole history of it, but it's the commitment to having a church that served all races in this section of Virginia in 1955 was an incredibly courageous thing to do. And this church has continued that legacy. And I detail in the book how it, at times, has paid the price for it. But it's something I think the members of this church should be very proud of and very aware of, that history. So that's one thing that's on my mind. I am currently, since this book was published, moved with my wife to Richmond. So my next project is about April 4th, 1865, when Abraham Lincoln toured the city of Richmond one day after it fell to Union forces with his son Tad on Tad's 12th birthday. And he came with only a small security detail, which for many, many years was viewed as evidence of his humility, when in fact, although he was a humble person, it was the result of a comedy of errors in which not one but two Navy admirals grounded their ships in the James River, and he was forced to take a small boat. So that's what I'm currently involved in.
Sounds interesting. We'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Before we close this part and open it up for questions, I would like us also to give a shout out to the county for the African American inventory that's available online. Anybody can do research. It's phenomenal.
Yes, that's been an ongoing project in cooperation with George Mason University's Center for Mason Legacies. And it's really a great resource for researching African American historic sites and properties and people. And there's also the Fairfax County History Commission has worked on an African American marker project, which is, I think, 8 or 9 new markers that are going to be dedicated over the next year or so. So now I will say something positive, since Penny is here, about the Board of Supervisors and herself in particular have really pushed the History Commission to tell the story of African American experiences in the county, and they've made a great deal of strides over the years. When I initially set out to write an article about this, I frankly thought it was going to end up being, this is a sad story of how they're stuck in the past, and that happily has turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, and one last thing about the inventory and the new markers. I understand from a friend on the History Commission that it's going to be several years. It takes a long time to get these markers installed. So it'll be a few years before we actually see them in place.
Yeah, I think this summer or fall, the first one's going to be dedicated.
Oh, good, yeah. And the other tip she gave me about the inventory, if anyone is interested in looking into it, is that the easiest way to use it is to narrow down the search, because it's unbelievable amount of information. So if you put in Annandale or Fairfax or your voting district, Braddock district, it narrows it down a lot, and then it's more manageable. But it's really wonderful. So we'll take some questions.
I neglected to mention earlier that following the questions, Tom will be in the atrium near where you came in to sign books. He has some for sale, so you'll have a chance to ask some personal questions later. But let's start now. I'm looking at a particular group, wondering if I might start there. The folks from Merrifield Baptist. I would give you precedence if you'd like to ask a question, since you're so much a part of the story.
I would like to ask a question.
And remember.
I want to go back to the point when you were talking about identifying the grave sites. And a part of the book where I was reading, it said something about the Guinea Road, when it was widened, some of it had already been paved. And I wanted to know a little bit more about how they determined that they needed to tear up Guinea Road, or if they did that, how they determined that there were grave sites already under Guinea Road. Would you talk a little bit more about that if you...
Yeah, they didn't determine, I'll put it this way, they didn't determine there were grave sites under Guinea Road, but they didn't determine that there weren't. So they said it was unlikely, and they established northern, southern, and western boundaries of the cemetery. And there are people, myself included, who think that it's very likely there are remains under what is now Guinea Road. And just as an aside, on Guinea Road itself, I did a fair amount of work into where that name came from, and came to the conclusion it's a problematic name for a road. And it almost certainly refers to, there is, again, family history that indicates there were slave quarters for African Americans on that road. And that's where there are some alternative explanations for that name, and they are preposterous. One is that it was named because of a guinea hen farm allegedly on the road. And the other was that that it cost a guinea to go on Little River Turnpike in that area, which the only two problems with that are there was no toll booth anywhere near there. It was way back in Annandale. And by the time Little River Turnpike was built, they'd long since stopped using British currency. So.
Hand over here.
Yeah, I was just curious about the families that were displaced for the high school that was never built, if you know what became of them. When I was a child in the 60s, I-64 came through my neighborhood. My neighbors were displaced. You know, the feeling was that, you know, it was a working class neighborhood. People didn't get a fair price. Certainly the families, you know, were forced out of the neighborhood. Their kids had to go to other schools. And I'm just wondering how much harder was it for these families and what happened to them?
It was pretty hard, and I don't know exactly where they went. I would defer maybe to if some of the descendants know what happened to if they could get the mic back there to speak to that issue of where.
Right in the middle of the park where our Liberty Cemetery is now, that used to be called the Pines. That was our neighborhood. And it was supposed to promise of a school there, but they never built a school, and they put a park there. So my brother, Harim, he went in and had that place probed, and we also have bodies there too. My great-great-grandfathers and uncles and aunts and even babies we don't have names. They just have markers. So that's where basically most of the people there were in the Merrifield area. That's where they were displaced to. And then after the 60s, they were displaced again. Most of them went to D.C., Maryland, or wherever.
Right.
I wanted to add to that, since I'm with the First Baptist Church of Merrifield, the property that we bought way back, we're 154 years old this year. And when the deed was set, it was in the deed, part of the document, that we could not have a cemetery on that property. In essence, the cemetery then at the Pines was used. And that was one of the runoffs of that as well. I did have one follow-up question about the school when the school was disbanded in Ilda, in the church, I know that the children and people had to traverse from there. Some of them came to Maryfield. And I was wondering if in your studies, and did you determine what path they had to take? Because I know it had to be rough through the woods, through the trails, and all of that. About 3 miles, I understand.
Yep, it was 2 to 3 miles down essentially what is now Woodburn Road. And I'll put it this way. In working on the book, I made it a point to go personally to a lot of these sites. So I went, tromped around the woods here more than once. I went to Germantown Cemetery, went to Fairfax City Cemetery for contrast, and I would encourage anybody to do that. They're relatively close to each other, but it'll tell you a lot of what you need to know about the difference between the African American experience and the white experience in this county over time. And I made the trek from the heart of Ilda to where the black school was in Ilda. I did that by car because it's not fun. That is a steep, steep hill.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. First of all, I haven't read your book yet, I'm sorry. Where is Ilda? What are the boundaries? What area are we talking about? And the second question is there a law that says construction has to stop if there are either suspected or proven bones, skeletal remains, or do people just do it? I mean, like the bulldozer operator, does he see this and say, oh my goodness, I have to stop? Or
Yes,
okay.
is the short answer.
Yeah.
So I'll answer your second question first, and then I'll forget the first one and ask you.
The first one was, where is Ilda?
Well, first of all, there's a state law in Virginia that it's a felony to disturb any remains at a cemetery. So once they found evidence of human remains, that stopped everything. And that began a process of negotiating what to do with the remains. At no point that I'm aware of did they seriously consider not widening the road. And, I won't speculate as to all the reasons for that. Dennis Howard, I know, ended up happy with the result, with the reinterment of the remains. And they are fairly prominently displayed in Pleasant Valley Memorial Park. There's a marker and the indication of where the remains are. And apparently the backhoe operator who initially did the work was just a wizard, I guess, and took this very seriously and ended up being the one to discover that there were remains there. As to the boundaries of Ilda, I didn't forget the first question. I always get asked that, and the short answer is I don't know. And I don't think there were official boundaries of Ilda because it was just a village that, so the heart of Ilda is what is now the Jewish Community Center on 236, where 236 come together. That's where the blacksmith shop was located and where the Gibsons and the Parkers had their homes. For a long time, people thought, and Harim Badil Abish thought this, I think, that the blacksmith shop was at Prosperity in 236. But I think I looked at this and looked at the records a lot of different ways. And I think that's because there used to be a country road that extended from Guinea Road after Little River Turnpike, roughly parallel to what's now Prosperity. And that's indicated as where the blacksmith shop and their homes were. And so it would go out sort of in concentric circles from there, certainly as far as prosperity. And I think where we are now would have been described as Ilda. There are references to Wakefield Chapel being in Ilda.
Oh, hello. What does your experience and your rewrite of this local history say about national efforts to stop the inclusion of African American history into the national narrative of this country?
It's sad and tragic evidence of a trend that just keeps repeating itself over the history of this country. And that is part of what I set out to do in this project, was to say, I want to make a deliberate effort as a white historian and writer, quite frankly, to marginalize the white voices and to focus on the black voices and the black stories. And people have a tendency to say that's very hard to do because there's not as much information and documentation as there is with historical events involving white people. But to that I say, you probably just need to work harder. And there's more information out there becoming available. A lot more, as I indicated earlier, is becoming available. But to the broader question, I think there just is simply a substantial and today very public faction of the country that doesn't want to see these stories told, that thinks it somehow comes at the expense of other people's stories. It's, you know, if you look back at what happened during the time of massive resistance to integration in this county, the efforts that were made to stop, to reinforce inequality and to stop people's stories from being heard were just much stronger than I imagined, and it is heartbreaking to me to see anything like that continuing today, and it is. I'll take as many as we have time.
I'm Penny Gross, and since my name has been mentioned several times, we have in Fairfax County so many little pockets of history that have been overlooked. And one of the challenges we have, I think, with the History Commission, which has been doing great work, is that everything absolutely has to be documented. So your local lore, your stories about what your grandmother and your great-grandmothers told, has to be backed up by something that actually is a legal document. And that is really, really hard. But I want to urge everybody here to do sort of what you did, Mr. Shoop, and that is write down the stories. Do your oral histories. We are losing every day the people who built our communities and who remember what it was like a long time ago. One of my concerns in looking at this audience, as wonderful as it is I'm not seeing a whole lot of young people in here. And if they don't hear the stories from folks who have done the research, they're not necessarily going to get it in school. They're going to get it in church. They're going to get it from families. They're going to get it from their neighbors. So let's not lose the opportunities, because every day things are getting older and getting, disparaged, put away, and saying, oh, nobody cares about that anymore. And so I want to make that impression on you to write it down, speak it into your phone, sit down at the dinner table and just start talking about what it used to be like. Because that's how you get your lore. That's probably really what is so much of the Merrifield community is that they have those kinds of things. I also wanted to just mention, there was a question about a law about disturbing cemeteries. In Fairfax County, when you apply for a building permit, especially if you're going to be doing a large development, when you go to the zoning, planning and zoning, you have to determine, to the best of your ability, whether there is a gravesite there. It isn't just that it gets discovered by the bulldozer. You have to have it all laid out well before then. But even at that, sometimes there are mistakes made. They didn't know somebody was buried there. And yes, you're right, that it has to stop right away, construction. There was something out in the Centerville area just a few years ago where they found bones and a Civil War uniform. Everything stopped until they could determine what that was, remove whoever was buried there, and then continue. So there is pretty strict approach in the county now, but I don't think it was always that way. So we've lost a lot. Thank you.
Can I follow with one question in reference to validating history? Because at Merrifield, we videotaped several of our older citizens who are gone now and talked about the area and once was, but it's actual video on them. So we can't use it as actual factual history because I don't think there's any documentation on much of it, but their oral presence and video, what would that do?
I think that kind of opportunity really helps inform what things were like, because you get a first-person narrative, even though you may not have the documentation, but that may also lead to questions going, now I heard this story, let's see if we can find something that backs it up in the deeds at the courthouse. You know, sometimes it's just that kind of little suggestion that's interesting. Let's see if we can follow that particular trail. But between the two, between the legal documentation and the oral histories, we get a pretty good picture of what it was like then, what it's like now, and hopefully what it will be like in the future.
If I could just add to that too, as someone who served on the History Commission for a couple of years, that process that Penny just described is taken very seriously, and there are people on the History Commission, that's their job, is to take some information like that and say, let's make sure this is really true. If there is strong family tradition in oral history, also, you'll see this on some markers that will simply say, if it seems to be almost certain that it's true, it'll say, according to tradition, blah, blah, blah. You know, as Penny indicated, the problem with the History Commission and markers in particular is, you know the phrase, well, it's not cast in stone. Well, it's cast in stone. And so they tend to be very fussy about details.
Two questions, and first a response. I think we have a bias towards written history in this country, and oral history tends to be downplayed, and we find that there are many other ways to show what's factual. And oral history is, in a lot of cases, a legitimate approach. It doesn't necessarily have to be written in a deed. The question I have is about the transition in the 60s in the Ilda community, because in the 60s you have Wakefield Forest, you have the fire station, you have a number of different things that changed hands there. I wish you could describe sort of the end of the Ilda community and the beginning of like suburbanization. What was that transition like?
You know, it was so gradual and so, you know, there wasn't a moment where they said, Ilda is no more. And it's still, I mean, there's still the Ilda pool and the Woods of Ilda housing development and various things like that. So it just gradually disappeared. So it turned from a place where I thought where the real indicator of its presence was, it was one of a handful of places in the Fairfax Herald at which they had regular dispatches from. So there'd be one from Vienna and one from Clifton and one from Ilda. It was on that level. And then it gradually, I mean, I think there's a point in 1963 where I quote a religion reporter talking about the opening of it's the church next to the fire station, I forget the name. But yes, Bethlehem Lutheran. And she wrote, well, this will give me a chance to see Ilda, if Ilda is really a place. So clearly by that point, it was sort of uncertain what its status really was. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I think that we're here because of a book club, y'all are reading this book through a book club called the what? Racism, what is it? Anti-racism. Well, first of all, I think that that's awesome for you all to have that type of book club. And I'd just like to know what birthed that book club within the church, and also how was Ilda chosen to be focused on?
Sure, I can say something about that. We've had a book group in the church for many years, part of the women's ministry. It started as a book group for women, and over time we did have men, we allowed men. And this year, for the first time, one of our members, Pam, suggested that we might try looking at a different way at the books, because we were doing still women, well, I would say books that were oriented more toward women's interests. And so this year, Pam suggested that instead of our selecting the books, that we have several different ministries in the church. We have the anti-racism ministry. We have a ministry that supports LGBT, the community. We have a board of social justice. And so we've gone to each of the boards and asked if they would like to pick a book that goes with their mission that we as a church could read. And so that's how we came to this book. James Waller from the ministry, the anti-racism ministry, and myself went to a book talk at Fairfax Library, and Tom was presenting this book, and James brought it back to the church, and people were very interested about finding out local history. So it's been wonderful.
So I think the short answer is they picked this book because it's so good.
And it's true.
Before we go to the last question, I just wanted to say one more thing, since I've mentioned Supervisor Gross a couple of times. In talking about how I got the idea for this book and what sort of the inspiration was, Supervisor James Walkinshaw, in whose district I lived, was a real inspiration to me. He did a video address. There was a year that during COVID when they couldn't do the open house at Oak Hill, and he did a video presentation in which he did a very short intro and then simply read the names of the enslaved people who worked there. And it was so powerful that it really, really made me think and really helped me get going. And he's been a great supporter of the book and the project ever since, so I wanted to thank him for that. I think there's a person in the back who's been waiting and waiting. And then we'll...
Hi, I'm so sorry. I actually met you about a year ago. We were eating at Shrinemont, and you asked me where I lived, and I told you, like, near the intersection of Guinea Road and Little River Turnpike.
I remember.
And you paused, and you said, oh, I just wrote a book about where you live. I'm like, oh, that's strange. But I read the book. Thank you very much for telling that very important story. And just to mention, because I'm not sure since you moved out of the area, I was driving around recently and saw that there's a new, actually senior residence in Fairfax, and it's called Ilda's Overlook. So I just actually checked the website while you were talking, and it actually tells the story of Ilda on the website. So it's brand new, I think, this year, and it talks all about the history of Ilda. So thank you for sharing that story with all the
sure.
people in Fairfax.
People have asked me if I had anything to do with that, and my answer is I wish I had. I believe Supervisor Walkinshaw might have had something to do with it. But.
So we'd like to close this afternoon. I know we could go on with more questions.
Before you close, I wanted to mention something. I'm the historian here at church, and I've found many documents that were written by Hubert Beckwith, who was our first pastor, and his son is actually here today. I would like to read it because, Tom, you mentioned the beginnings of this church. When Dr. Beckwith came here, he came from Connecticut, so quite a different life than here, and he wasn't certain he wanted to come. It was right after 1954, which most of you know what happened in 1954, I think. When he came, he asked the church why they thought they could start a church like this in this part of the country. One of the mothers, who was under 32, he said she was young because most of us were under 32, her response to him was, I want two things. First, for myself and my children, I want a church which teaches a faith not totally counter to reason and everything else we learn in life. Faith is more than understanding, but should not be opposed to what we know. Secondly, I want a church which expresses a biblical faith that relates to the society in which I live, and specifically will take action for justice and brotherhood in the field of race. In other words, a church not only open to all, but out there working to break down the separation. When all the other heads shook in agreement, I decided to come.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you so much, and we'd like to close certainly by thanking you for coming from Charlottesville to spend this afternoon with us.
My pleasure.
And finally, I would like to thank everyone in the audience for coming today and showing your interest in this really important work.
This is not a question, it's just a logistics fact. Again, echoing Karen and everyone else's work, what we do have post the formal presentation is we have a refreshment area in the coffee area with snacks and water and water and water. You know, no coffee. And also the book signing table for Tom is set up in front of the Eagle Scout plaque.
Great. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.